Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event with author Christopher Dick, presented by University of Michigan Press. We'll be watching for audience questions throughout the event. If you're on Zoom, please submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom center of the screen. If you're watching on Facebook, please let us know your question in a comment. You can turn captions on or off using the live transcript button in Zoom at the bottom right side of the screen. We'll be recording the event this evening and sharing it on our Facebook page later in the week. My guest tonight, Christopher Dick, is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Michigan, as well as curator of the University of Michigan Herbarium, a world-class collection of 1.7 million specimens of vascular plants, algae, mosses, fungi, and other phylum. On the teaching front, Chris has been heavily involved in the University of Michigan's beloved undergraduate course, Woody Plants, which was originally developed by one of Chris's longtime colleagues, Burton Barnes, who passed away in 2014. Before his death, Bert collaborated with Chris and another co-author, Melanie Gunn, on a new book titled Michigan Shrubs and Vines. One goal for the book was to serve as a supplement to the main textbook, Michigan Trees, that was used in the Woody Plants course. The current edition of Michigan Trees was authored by Bert and another renowned University of Michigan botanist, Herb Wagner, in 2004. But various iterations of the book have been in print going back to 1913. At that time, the book's cover featured a notice that all Michigan residents were eligible to receive a free copy of the book from the University of Michigan. Non-residents had to pay 25 cents to get theirs. A fair amount has changed since that time, but Michigan Trees and Michigan Shrubs and Vines remain among the best resources available for learning about our region's woody plants. Chris, thank you so much for being with us tonight to talk about both books, the Woody Plants course, and our region's forest ecology more generally. Oh, I think you're muted, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, and thank you to everybody who's come to this conversation. Scott asked me to talk a little bit about my background, and I'll talk a little bit about my research background, and then transition into a discussion about the Woody Plants class and how that has influenced developing Michigan Trees and Michigan Shrubs and Vines. So let me share. Okay. Okay, here we go. So this is this picture of me with my lab group a couple of years ago when we were in Manaus, Brazil. And I would say that this is my favorite habitat, which is a tropical rainforest. I got my first research experience working in the tropics in the very early 90s when I was a collector for the New York Botanical Garden, working in forests in Manaus, Brazil, to try to document its tree diversity. I came back to Manaus, Brazil, to do my PhD fieldwork. And at that time, I became very interested in the population genetics of tropical trees, and in particular, the importance of pollinators and seed dispersers in dispersing the genes of trees and their role in the evolution of these trees. And I became very interested in a conservation question, which was what happens to enormous rainforest trees when they're isolated from the rest of the rainforest and found in the middle of pastures, like is often the case in Amazonia, where large trees are left standing. And I wanted to know if those trees were still viable, because almost all of those rainforest trees need to be pollinated by animals, mostly insects, and their seeds need to be dispersed by animals, but those animals were not available. So this is where I was working in Manaus, right in the middle of Amazonia, Amazon rainforest. I decided to work with this tree called Danesia excelsa, which is in the legume family. And in order to study the pollinators, I had to climb these trees. And this is one of my most fantastic field experiences. This was looking down at my research collaborator at the time, but you can see how large these trees are. And they stand right in the middle of pasture, no forest anywhere around. So that was a kind of an interesting study where we learned that trees that were isolated from the rest of the rainforest were still being pollinated extensively because Africanized honeybees had taken over the pollination function. And so that set me on a path of wanting to learn more and more and more about trees in general. And this is just an interesting note. It was just discovered last year that the species that I studied, it turns out it's the largest tree species in Amazonia. And there was an individual that was found that was 290 feet tall, 32 feet in circumference. So that was kind of interesting. So more recently, I've focused not on population genetics, but on systematics of a family called the Leslidaceae, and that's the Brazil nut family. All of you should be familiar with Brazil nuts. These are the ones you find in cocktail mixes of seeds at Christmas time. A very important tree for culture and economy in the Amazon basin. There are these horticultural species like the cannonball tree, and also very important timber species like this tree that is found in southern Brazil. So I've recently studied these. One thing that's interesting about studying tropical trees is their taxonomy is often very poorly understood. And there are many new species to be discovered and described. This was a species that was discovered only in the early 2000s in the cloud forest in Colombia. And you'd wonder how a species like this with a leaf like that could go unnoticed. And this is the flower. And the type specimen to describe the species was collected in 2009. This is one of my students at the University of Michigan who is studying the family in Colombia. So when I was working in these rainforests and doing the work as a collector, I really struggled to learn to identify the tree species, as many as I could. So this meant I had to spend many hours working alongside Brazilian woodsmen who had grown up in these forests. There were rubber tappers, loggers, hunters. They knew their way around the forest, and they knew how to identify species because they were using them most of the time for medicinal purposes, but also for navigation through the forest. And one of the best ways to identify these trees in the field is to use a machete and break through the outer bark and look at what we call the inner bark. And you can see that each species in this genus of Eschweileria has a different color and a different pattern of what we call this slash of the inner bark. So even though there's not much variation in the form of the bark necessarily, they often have smooth bark, and it's very hard to see flowers up in the canopy. It's hard to see the leaves, but you could go and you can cut into the side of the tree and get some good detailed information for identifying the tree. And this was all information that I had to pick up. There were no field guides. There were monographs that I could use. But, it remained a challenge, and something that I needed and wanted to do was to identify trees in these forests. And believe it or not, some of these forests contain up to, on average, about 300 tree species per hectare, sometimes 1,000 tree species in an area that's the size of like the Diag at the University of Michigan. Lots of species. So as part of this work, we make a lot of herbarium specimens. We try to get up into the canopy when there are flowers available. These are also where important diagnostic characters are to identify the trees. This is one of my graduate students, just graduated, and one of our woodsmen, Paulo. Here's a little video about showing how we actually get herbarium specimens from these trees in the forest. Not sure if I can get the sound on this one, but I'll just show the video here. Out of bark. And what this is showing, this was our field technician, 55 years old, and he learned to climb trees when he was a kid, climbing up palm trees in order to get the palm fruits. You've heard of acai. So he climb up to the top of a palm, cut the branch with the fruits on it with a machete, and then bring it back down to make juices and things. And so we employ these people to help us get up into the canopies of these trees with long pruning tools, and then cut flowers from the very tops of the trees. Once we do that, we could put those in our make herbarium specimens and then come back and identify them, get DNA, understand evolutionary relationships, and so this is something that we did. Okay, so my research background has not been in Michigan. I'm actually originally from Pennsylvania, but I know a lot of the I knew a lot of the trees because of growing up in Pennsylvania. But coming to Michigan was something new for me, really thinking deeply about temperate forests. And by the way, does anybody have an idea? You know, one thing that's different about Michigan compared to Amazonian rainforest is you can identify probably most of the large trees by their bark from a distance. And so this is a tree that obviously has a distinctive bark. I'm wondering if anyone has a guess of what species that might be. And if you have a guess, you can put it in the questions section. And maybe Danielle or Scott, you can let me know if anybody's made a guess.
So far, our first guess is shagbark hickory from Marta Manildi.
Okay, that's probably what I would have thought initially, but it's actually not. Give you another try.
We have quite a few thumbs up for shagbark hickory, so a lot of people agreeing that's what it looked like to them.
Okay, so in fact, this is red maple. And you can see that when a red maple gets so old, more than 100 years old probably, it starts to look like a shagbark hickory. So there's a lot that has to do with finding a tree in the right stage of its life to easily identify it. And that's something that I also learned from Bert Barnes. So that is red maple, and we'll talk a little bit about red maple later on. So I got to Michigan in 2005, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to teach. And I heard about this class, Woody Plants, that Bert Barnes and Melanie Gunn were teaching for the last time before Bert retired. And a friend of mine was taking in the class, a guy named Paul Fine, who's now at Berkeley, told me how great it was, a lot of fun. Students were getting out into the field. They're identifying things and enjoying it. And so I requested to be able to take over this class. And at the time, the program and the environment really wanted to just end the class because it was so expensive to run, especially with transportation issues, renting vans and everything is very complicated. But I did manage to be able to teach the class the year after Bert retired. And I approached Bert and asked him all about the class. And I never imagined such a generous person in terms of being generous with his time. And he would I would ask him a question, and he would send me pages of information that he would just type about aspects of the course, the logistics, how it was run, what to think about. And so this is, for Woody Plants, we often have these evening laboratory quizzes or tests and Halloween, which we call the Halloween How, where students would dress up as sort of Woody Plants themed costumes. And here was a student dressed up as Michigan trees, and Bert came along by with his aspen shirt. He's a real fanatic about aspens. And so Bert, when Bert retired, he wanted to finish something that he had begun working on decades before, which was a book that was a guide to the shrubs and the vines of Michigan as a complement to Michigan trees. And so that's, later on, I began working more in earnest with Bert on that. I also collaborated with Bert on some evolutionary studies of the red maple. And that picture that I showed before was a postdoc that worked with Bert and I on the red maple biology. So Woody Plants, the class, it was first taught in 1965. So it's in its 57th year, 58th now. And so one of the goals of the class, which is common in any kind of winter botany class, is just to be able to learn to identify woody plant species in the fall and the winter condition. So the students come in September, they've got green leaves everywhere. They're really reliant on the green leaves to identify things and on gestalt images that they have for different trees. But as time goes along, the leaves change colors and then fall off, and they're left with twigs and buds. And so we try to get them to be more analytical about thinking about what other characters besides leaves can you use to identify trees in the middle of winter. The other really important goal of woody plants, because there were dendrology classes that studied trees on campus, but they never made the connection between those species and their natural environment. Oftentimes they were geared toward horticulture or toward timber uses. And so the most students would take a walk around campus to learn the campus trees. And so Herb Wagner and Bert and their student found excellent places in Southeast Michigan to go and visit and have different natural communities where the students could learn sets of species in each community on a weekly basis over the course of the semester, so that by the end of the course, they would not only be able to know to identify more than 150 woody species, but also know where they're likely to be found and a little bit about their ecology, their evolution, and their natural history. So one thing that is important in class for trees is the bud, the winter bud. And so the bud is like a cocoon that holds the preformed leaf that will come out in the spring. And these buds, which are especially charismatic in the temperate zone, often we typically don't find these in tropical trees because they don't have to, the new leaves don't have to endure a winter in dormancy. But if you look at these twigs and the buds, you can see that they're very distinctive. So, so students learn how to identify species on the basis of these buds, but it's very hard to put them in any kind of organization. A lot of times students just have to learn them. And this is where memorization comes in and plays a big role. So they'll look at the American beech, they say that really looks like a cigar. It's the only thing I can think of. They'll look at bitternut hickory. They'll try to figure out some way to link the bud and the way that the bud looks with the species. So that's a big challenge for the students that I think they like. Some hate it. But it's something that is a feature that we try to show. You know, if you do learn the buds, then you'll have a really good set of tools for identifying tree species, no matter, especially in the winter time. These are different places that we visit with the class here in Southeast Michigan. There may be some alumni of woody plants, and you'll recognize some of these places. We go to a tiny fragment of beech maple forest over at Miller Woods. As we go out toward the west, there are many oak hickory forests. We go down to Lawrence Woodlot. More south of Ann Arbor, we get into the Lake Plain areas. So all of these different sites have different tree communities, and we try to emphasize that if you know what community you're in, you're going to already have a good idea of what species you'll find in them, and that'll help you to identify them and learn more about them. So this is the Lawrence Woodlot site. This is near Milan, Michigan. A very flat, sandy area, some really interesting, mostly southern species of trees. This is Haven Hill, north of Ann Arbor, which is what we call a wet mesic forest and swamp area. And at this time in the semester, the leaves are fantastic. Waterloo, it's got oak hickory forest, and we try to teach the glacial history because glacial history will also tell you what kind of species you're likely to find in a particular location in Michigan. And this is Mud Lake Bog. This is the most challenging site. When we visit here, it's already November, late November. Leaves have fallen off the trees. There's poison sumac all over. And we have to walk through a hardwood swamp in order to get to the sphagnum bog. And students often fall in. I'm going to share. Let me share, new share. Oh, let's see. Okay. Let's try that. There's Ben O'Connor. He's a GSI for Woody Plant, a graduate student instructor. Our graduate students do an amazing job taking care of the graduate students, taking them into small groups out into these sites. And we try to prepare the students as best we can. Now we've graduated to waders. We give them waders in order to get out to the bog. You can see once they get out into the bog, they're going to see species that they have not seen elsewhere. Okay, so back to the slide presentation. So Mud Lake Bog represented swamp and bog ecosystems, which are historically pretty common in Michigan. So these are the two textbooks that we use for the class. And the reason why it's relevant to talk about the class is because apart from the identification aspects of the books, which you'll find in many field guides, the book also emphasized this other kind of knowledge about the trees and the forests. And so we have Michigan trees and then Michigan shrubs and vines. And as Scott mentioned, it has a 110-year history. A curator in the Mathey Botanical Garden, Charles Otis, was encouraged to publish a handbook of Michigan trees based on notes from teaching dendrology at the time. And they wanted this book to be useful for Michigan students and the general public. And they wanted it to focus on, common trees that one could find in parks, in streets, and in forests. So not specifically in Michigan natural communities. 1981, so that was published almost continuously. I think initially maybe it wasn't U of M Press, but then at some point, maybe 1915, U of M Press took it. Is that correct?
That's right, yep.
Okay, published it pretty continuously. 1981, I think, perhaps Herb and Bert waited until Charles Otis died, because Charles Otis died in like 1979. But Herb and Bert did a completely revised version of Michigan trees where they included all that ecological information. So they used the same drawings that Charles Otis himself did the line drawings for, and he had another person ink it in. But they used those excellent drawings, which highlighted key characters, diagnostic characters. They added new species, new artwork. They had essays on Michigan ecosystems, and they expanded the book to include more about the Great Lakes. Even though all the maps, all the description was mostly about Michigan, they wanted to emphasize that the species could be found throughout the Great Lakes region. And they include an appendix which described, without any illustrations, common shrubs and vines that the students in the classes learned. So in 2004, Wagner and Barnes revised Michigan trees once again, this time adding rare species, adding hybrids, and just with the things that they were interested in. I mean, the book has things like chromosome numbers, for each species, which is kind of odd, but they were very interested in hybridization and evolution. And so not everybody who wants to identify trees is going to be interested in that, but it was just part of the information that was given for each species. And as I mentioned, when Bert retired, he began to work in earnest on Michigan Shrubs and Vines, and I helped him with that. And I helped him and Melanie Gunn publish Michigan Shrubs and Vines. And Michigan Shrubs and Vines is very similar in its layout and structure. with dichotomous keys, essays about ecology, biogeography, what makes shrubs and vines distinctive from trees. And so it was meant to be a companion volume to Michigan Trees. So this is a look inside of Michigan Trees. You can see that we have, for each species gets 2 pages. I forget how many species there are altogether, maybe 110 species of trees. About 70 of them are native species, so it has quite a few introduced species as well. We have the scientific family name, species name, common name, and then it goes into this order of size and form, bark, leaves, twigs, winter buds, wood, flowers, fruit, distribution, habitat, and then notes. And here's that chromosome number. And then over here are key characters. And this is the part that I really emphasize to woody plant students that they should pay close attention to. And these are the characters that will distinguish a given species from the close relatives. And those characters are often found in the drawings. So you can see the leaf margin here is actually pretty important, and that's why it's included, the bud. So this is what the core part of both books has in terms of identification, along with dichotomous keys. So just within this one category of leaves, you can see that it's further subdivided. And the way that this is organized is the authors want you to think about leaf arrangement first, blade division second. So it's prioritized. So the way that it's presented linearly is the way that you really should think about it. So reading through, it sort of helps you develop as a botanist, think about what characters are going to be important for you in the field to identify these taxa, these species. The themes that are in the essays in both of these books reflect what we consider important to teach our students. And that's why I wanted to mention the Woody Plants class. We teach about biogeography and evolution. In other words, why do we have this particular set of tree species in Michigan? Why are some of the genera of trees that we find here, why do we also find them in Asia or South America? How do they assemble into this community, into communities? We talk about aspects of forest ecology, how forests have changed since pre-settlement times, how they're likely to change in the future, and also cultural uses. There was Michigan Trees is heavy on a lot of like timber uses and things like that, but it also has mentioned medicinal uses of plants and other ways, interesting cultural notes about the species. So here I'll just give you some example of the themes that we cover. This is an example of, this map shows how vegetation in Michigan has changed from 1800 to the present. And so if we look at the pre-settlement vegetation right here in Michigan, we see a lot of brown in Southeast Michigan, and that is oak forest and savanna. Of course, this color here, I'm not sure what that color is called, a bluish color, that's non-forest. So that's either going to be prairie or agricultural. And so in Michigan, a lot of what we see here is now converted land into something else. So how do we know so much about what the landscape looked like in the pre-settlement times, pre-settlement by Europeans? We know because when Michigan became a state in 1837, there was a detailed survey of the natural resources of the state of Michigan and just a general land survey in which the surveyors visited made a grid of the entire state, a mile with up to 1/16 of a mile grid points. And so every point where they would stop in the survey, the surveys would get information about the landscape. They would say, this is a swampy landscape. This is an oak savanna landscape. So there were detailed notes that they took. They also, on all their survey points, they often used trees to mark the surveys. And so where these trees that were selected to carve in the coordinates, these were called witness trees. And there was often information about what those witness trees were. You know, it was American chestnut, was it a red maple? The other knowledge that we have about the early landscapes in Michigan are in our herbarium. And so here is this is from the University of Michigan Herbarium. This was a prairie species. Let's see, Buchnera americana. It was collected in 1838 in the first or second year of the Geological Survey. And it's never been collected in Michigan since then. It's not been seen in Michigan since then. The reason being is that there are no longer any prairie remnants like this in Michigan. So that was a kind of ecosystem that was already at its sort of easternmost fringe at that time in the 1800s, and now it's no longer around. So we have a bunch of data, you know, herbarium specimens, descriptions, and also those specimens can be laid over the geological map of Michigan to come up with a detailed understanding of the historical plant communities. And this is work that that you can find. This information is done by the Michigan Natural Features Inventory on their website. But here is Washtenaw County. We got Ann Arbor right here. And this shows what the vegetation was like, most likely like back in 1800. And you can see all of these natural communities. So here, you know, here sort of like right in the middle where Ann Arbor is, let's see, that is probably a mixed oak forest. But you can see you have oak hickory forests everywhere. Some areas with beech maple, black ash swamps, conifer swamps. See these different colors. Obviously, if you go into a place like Detroit, there's not going to be any signature of any of these past habitats. But in our natural areas here in Ann Arbor, in this region, we'll find remnants of these habitats. And some of them, like we know that the beech sugar maple forests, those are the areas most likely to have excellent soils. Those are the ones that were most quickly destroyed or converted to agriculture. The other thing that's interesting when we look at this map is that we know that a lot of these natural communities required some frequency of fire in order to maintain them. They were dependent on fire to some degree or another. For example, if there is no periodic fire, then an oak savanna will just turn into an oak forest. And if there's no regular fire, an oak hickory forest can turn into a forest that's dominated by red maple, black cherry, species that otherwise would be fire sensitive. So this is another thing, and Bert and I discussed this quite a bit. There's also descriptions of what Ann Arbor was like, you know, in terms of having savanna types of habitats in the area of the city and in the county. And this is a description about the beauty of the flowers in the spring. And the person who's writing this in 1839, they said that the country had been burnt over every fall or spring, I presume, for centuries. And everything that had been destroyed except these giants of the forest, those were the oaks. It did appear as if one half the vegetation was flowers. Most of them were about 18 inches high, and when moved by the wind, the effect was wonderful. So the people who came here very early on recognized that there were, you know, a long history of managing the landscape with fire. And when Bert and I first talked about this, Bert actually thought that that this fire was mostly from lightning strikes. But the more that we looked into it, the more we realized that most of this fire, in our view, probably was from Native American fire practices and fire management. So it gave us a very different perspective that the landscape that the European settlers found was a very highly modified Native American landscape. So we find that very interesting. So a major change in the forest right now is that all of these oak hickory forests that are to the west of Ann Arbor are being slowly replaced by red maple. Red maple used to be called swamp maple because it was relegated to swampy areas. And with the suppression of fire, red maple has been able to come out of these swamp areas and take over upland areas. And it grows, it's more competitive than oak and hickory. It can shade oak and hickories out. And as long as there's no fire to eliminate it, it will eventually take over. So that's a process that's happening right now in our forests. This is the website for the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, a really excellent site for understanding natural ecosystems in Michigan and communities. And I also want to recommend our herbariums, the Michigan Flora website. This is managed by our guru of Michigan botany, Tony Resnicek, who's just fantastic in all aspects of botany in Michigan. And he keeps this updated regularly, and it's being moved to a new site. So right now you can find a county map of distributions, geographic distribution, where there's just a dot if it's found in the county. But in the new site, you'll be able to see all of the specimens that we have in their more precise locations. So this is another excellent resource. Okay, that's all I had there, Scott.
No problem. That was terrific, Chris. Thank you so much. I guess the first question that came to my mind as we were going through your slides, you mentioned kind of the incredible species diversity in the Amazon forest. How does the kind of Great Lakes forest compare in terms of species diversity here?
So we probably have, in the eastern United States, all of the tree diversity has a similar amount of tree diversity as you would find in 1 hectare of forest in the western Amazon. So you probably have about 500 or so species in the eastern United States, many of those in Michigan, maybe 140 or 150. In the Amazon basin, it's estimated about 16,000 tree species. So it's very different, but it also means that you can actually learn them. So you can, within 1 semester, you can actually learn most of the species, but it's a lifelong thing. You don't learn them intimately, in 1 year. You have to learn them over a lifetime. And just like with that red maple, you learn what the saplings look like. You learn what the adults look like, and then you learn what these ancient individuals look like. You learn to identify them from a distance by the color of their leaves and everything else. So it's just a matter of gaining more familiarity.
Are we seeing new species come into Michigan and the Great Lakes region, either escapees from horticultural use or species moving due to climate change, that sort of thing?
Yes, many species are becoming naturalized in our forests. Not as many tree species are becoming like invasive as our shrubs, like Japanese barberry, the honeysuckles. So I think and then the vines like Asian bittersweet. So there are just many, and so any future addition of Michigan trees, Michigan shrubs and vines is going to have to take that into account. That our natural environments, our natural communities, are changed communities, and these new species are a part of that.
Could you talk a little bit, Chris, about that distinction between trees and shrubs? Is that a scientific distinction, or is that more of a kind of a popular usage?
Yeah, it's a real tough one. I mean, obviously, it's easy for the large trees and for most shrubs to distinguish them, but there are many species that can be both trees and shrubs, and so there are about 7 species that overlap between Michigan trees and Michigan shrubs and vines. Like a lot of the hawthorns, for example, they can be a small tree, or they can have a shrubby form. Even poison ivy can have a shrubby form and a tree form. So there's a lot of flexibility and plasticity in that gray area between shrubs and vines. I typically think vines are pretty easy, the woody ones at least, to distinguish from the other taxa. But yeah, it is tough, and there are lots of different definitions in those forests in the Amazon. Oftentimes, they'll lump trees and shrubs together. It doesn't matter if they have multiple stems coming out of the bottom. As long as it has a certain diameter of stem at breast height, it would be considered a tree. And so, yeah, it is tough to distinguish the difference between shrubs and trees a lot of times.
We've gotten a handful of questions from the audience that are kind of more focused on the care of specific species for horticultural uses. I don't think that's so much your area, Chris, but are there any resources that you can think of that would be valuable for people to take a look at?
Yeah, for example, the Ann Arbor, for example, people that are interested in city trees and what to plant. I think the city, forestry program, it's on the local government, website, has lists of trees that are planted in as urban forests. And it really takes a special kind of tree that can endure the abuse that you find in an urban setting in terms of having compacted soil, frequently exposed to drought, flooding, salt. And so there's only a subset of species that are actually useful as street trees, but it lists them, and it lists, the small ones that are going to be useful to plant under telephone wires. But there are a lot of resources for horticulture that others would be more knowledgeable about than me in terms of particular species.
We've also gotten a couple questions focused on the impact of invasive bug species, emerald ash borer, that sort of thing on Michigan's native trees.
Yeah, I think there's just one wave of catastrophic pests that come through like every 5 years or so, and starting back with American chestnut, we see our forests deeply affected by insect pests, typically that are brought from Asia, because like I mentioned, a lot of our genera of trees that we find here are also found in Asia. And so the Asian flora has adapted to its pests and has developed resistance to many of them in co-evolutionary relationships. But if any of those pests make it over here, they can just go crazy on our trees that are not necessarily resistant to them. And so one example is the fungus that's associated with the chestnut blight. The other is certainly the emerald ash borer. And it does seem like there is, within populations of of the ashes, the different species of ash, there are more resistant individuals. But in this first round, we've lost nearly all, or probably 98% of the large American ash trees. I think 10,000 were cut down in the city streets of Ann Arbor in around 2006 or so. And so I think, not only are there lots of introduced pests that our species are not adapted to or have a resistance for, but when our species are stressed by climatic conditions like drought, then they're just more susceptible to dying off because of that, because of those being weakened by those pests. So yeah, our trees in the future, I think our forests are going to be very different in composition, perhaps more rich in species. They'll still have lots of ecological interactions, but they'll be different. They'll have a different composition.
Chris, are temperate forests more vulnerable to the invasive pests and that sort of thing, or are tropical forests experiencing the same things right now?
I think invasives are less frequent. There are some shrubs that are actually really invasive, and especially if you put them in a place like Hawaii or even in Central America in some places, there are some species that are pretty invasive. But we just don't know of examples in the same way that we have in the temperate areas. And I think one reason is just tropical trees are just very, very well defended against all kinds of pests. They don't have a winter dormancy where their pests sort of die off. They're dealing with them year round for the most part. And the problem that we have now is also a little bit of a colonialism issue. Most of the horticultural specimens came from Asia to North America. And so that there's just this continual stream of plants that can persist here because it's a very similar environment. They just have a different evolutionary history.
We have a question about the woody plants course. Are most of the students that are in the woody plants course coming from the School of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, or are they from all sorts of different academic backgrounds?
So about half. So this last semester we started out with over 80 students. We have pretty good attrition. Usually about 20 of them end up leaving the course after midway, but about half the students are graduate students. They come from the School of the Environment and Sustainability, SEAS. About half of those students from SEAS are from Landscape Architecture program. So they're learning the native plants in order to incorporate them in a very applied way to landscape design. And then the others are mostly, ecologist students just interested more generally in botany in the environment.
Are there ever any opportunities for non-students to survey woody plants or kind of get something out of the course?
Well, during the pandemic, we had to we had so many students that were dropping out because of illness and couldn't go to the field that we ended up videotaping a lot of the field notes about species. And some of those are in pretty rough condition, but you can still look at those online, and we might develop those a little further to help people, with video material and things like that. But we usually only people can audit the lectures just because it costs so much and our vans are so crowded we can only take the students out. But the Michigan Botanical Club often has woody plants types of excursions. I saw there was one recently with a woody plants alum that was talking about how to identify woody plants in the winter. So if people want to, I think that would be a good resource, Michigan Botanical Club. The other thing that is kind of interesting is iNaturalist. A lot of people are probably familiar with that, but that's an app that you can take a picture of a plant that you see outdoors. And the photograph has the locality information, and it has a machine learning algorithm that can help you decide on what is a possible identification. And then oftentimes there's a community of people that can look over the identification and see if it's correct or not. Not quite as good as reading through Michigan trees or shrubs and vines, but it's a good supplement to that. And you can plop into a place and look at all the prior identifications and see what you might expect in a particular location. So that's iNaturalist.
We have another question about what the future holds for Michigan Trees, the book. And I know there's probably not a lot you can share at this point, but is there anything you can share at this point?
Well, I'm interested in revising Michigan Trees a bit. And I've been talking that over with some of our botanists in the herbarium and with others. The book has always wanted to be more than just Michigan, more about the Great Lakes region. So I think it would be interesting to sort of expand the coverage, the geographic coverage of the book to include parts of the Great Lake drainage basin that are in our neighboring states and provinces. The other thing would be to include range maps to think about which species are most important in natural settings, because originally the book was, like I said, it was for students to identify trees in streets, parks, and in forests. I think I would like to focus more on forests and in natural communities. And then just, names change. Species get assigned to new families as botanical knowledge changes. So there are just some general updates that we need to do to keep it updated.
That will be so exciting to have the book revised and give it a refresh as it moves into its second century in print.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have a few minutes left. So if there are any questions, please do submit those using the Q&A feature. Another question I wanted to tackle, Chris, was about the herbarium. Is the herbarium open to the public? Can people come in and see some of the collections there? Or how can they, get a better look at what's held there?
So the herbarium it's a research museum. And we have several research museums at U of M, including Museum of Zoology. Historically, the public has been very important in developing the collections for Michigan. And Tony Rezenchek, who I mentioned before, is a key person in interacting with people and telling them, oh, it would be great to find, get a specimen from such species in this county. If you're out in this area, can you keep your eye open? And just to sort of expand our collections in the Michigan area. But most of the time, it's not open for the general public. If somebody has a botanical interest and they want to use the collections, then they just have to reach out and we can let them come in. And we may have opportunities in the future to do things like plant mounting or imaging, and we're still working on some of those outreach things. But mostly we're just kind of like a library of botanical knowledge for researchers in botany for the most part.
Just got a question. Why are there so many genera from Asia rather than Europe?
That's a great question. Mainly because if you go back 12 million years, these genera were all over Europe, Asia, North America. And then we had the ice ages of the past couple million years. And so there were many, many extinctions that happened of these genera. So, for example, things like ginkgo, tree of heaven, ailanthus, they used to be here in Michigan, in our area, but they went extinct, at some point in time. Europe suffered the greatest extinctions. The ways that the glaciers came down and pushed the vegetation into the Alps and into the Mediterranean Sea, it just had many, many more genera that just died off, like hickories and some others. And so that's why if you look at the distribution of some of these genera, you'll see them in Asia and then Eastern North America, but they bypass Europe because of the extinctions. They bypass the Western United States because it's all dried out. And all of these areas were connected by like the Bering Land Bridge, the same way that humans got over. These forests and different continents were connected, especially during warmer periods in time when temperate zone forests went up to the Arctic Circle, when they went up to very high latitudes. And that's why they were able to exchange and move back and forth at different times. So yeah, a little by geography, and some of that is explained in both of the books.
Another quick one, Chris, are you familiar with the website Native Plant Finder, and do you have any thoughts on it?
No, I'm not really familiar with that site. I don't have an opinion on it.
You mentioned a couple sites, Michigan National Features Inventory, as well as michiganflora.net. And we've linked those in the chat. Any other websites you go to frequently when researching?
Let's see. Yeah, like, mainly my main go-to is the Michigan Flora. I use that all the time. It's also useful because it has lots of images, pictures in the field, as well as herbarium specimens. So if you just want to get a different angle on something that you don't see in the drawing, that's a good place to see it, along with whatever information Tony writes in. And a lot of it's also from Ed Voss, who also worked on the Michigan Flora. Like I said, at different times, I've used iNaturalist a lot. So you can go to the iNaturalist website and look and see what has been, where species are expanding their ranges just from citizens, people that aren't necessarily researchers, that are interested in natural history, taking pictures of things and putting them on this site. And there are other herbarium websites, University of Wisconsin, Madison, Minnesota. Sometimes I visit those as well.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to turn to the last question we've been asking every single author, and that's, what have you been reading lately?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just finished a great book that I got in the local neighborhood free library. It's called Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, which I thought was really good. Another book that I recently read was that's more woody plants oriented. Is called The Nature of Oaks by Doug Tallamy. And he talks a lot about the insects that are associated with oaks and going through their life history and different stages and different seasons. And I thought that was pretty good too. And I would recommend that one.
Great. We'll be sure to include those titles on our Facebook page so people can check them out. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being with this evening. The two books we talked about tonight are Michigan Shrubs and Vines and Michigan Trees. Both will continue to be on sale through the end of the month, and we'll include information on that in both the chat as well as on Facebook. Chris, any closing thoughts?
No, just thank you everyone for expressing an interest and coming to this conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you again, Chris. Good night, everyone.
Good night.